Hi. In this video, I want to introduce the argument frame of analogy. Analogy is credited with being central to how we think. The community of researchers see our ability to connect two domains, thinking of one thing in one domain as though it were something else in another domain, as fundamental to how we know the world. We use analogies to explain the subject, generally complex or simply difficult for our reader to understand, in terms we normally use for something we expect the reader to be familiar with. Analogies are discovered by consulting the members of other categories that might feature a member which offers corresponding features to our subject. One frame that is based on categories is genus-species, discussed in another video of mine. The frame of analogy, though, not only takes advantage of a thinking process natural to us, according to researchers, but a powerful way to problem solve and argue. This video will focus on how analogies are structured and how they explain. We will look at examples from scientists' and mathematicians' use of analogies to describe and explain technical ideas without resort to the language of science. Anyone who tries to describe modern physics without the use of mathematical formulas knows how useful analogies can be. For example, it is very helpful to think of an atom as a miniature solar system, and the use of ordinary Newtonian mechanics to describe a dark star can help someone who is not ready to plunge into the advanced mathematics of general relativity. In the late 16th century, when mathematician Johannes Kepler was puzzling about why some planets revolved close to the sun and others farther away, he wrote, "One of two conclusions must be reached. Either the moving souls, planets, are weaker the farther they are from the sun, or there is a single moving soul in the center of all the spheres, that is, in the sun, and it impels each body more strongly in proportion to how near it is. Let us suppose, then, as is highly probable, that motion is dispensed by the sun in the same proportion as light. Now the ratio in which light spreading out from a center is weakened as stated by the opticians. For the amount of light in a small circle is the same as the amount of light in the solar rays in the greater one. Hence, it is more concentrated in a small circle and more thinly spread in the great one. The measure of this thinning out must be sought in the actual ratio of the circles, both for light and for the moving power." The "let us suppose" is his clue that an analogy is coming. That if the motive force, what Newton later called gravity, of the sun is anything like the light from the sun, it is 1, equally distributed, and 2, emanates in all directions equally. These two properties of light would, if gravity is like light, explain why the planets are distributed in their distance from the sun. The farther they are, the weaker light is. Therefore, the weaker the sun's motive force, or gravity, must be. The weakening power is, according to Kepler, not a result of the loss of power, but rather is due to its spreading outward to larger and larger distances, more concentrated and therefore greater at closer distances. Kepler's aim in this is to show that the celestial machine is to be likened not to a divine organism, but rather to a clockwork. Analogies seemed integral to how Kepler thought about the universe. When Darwin was trying to understand what could account for the slow changes in the features of species he saw in Galapagos, he found the answer while reading about population economics by Thomas Malthus. Malthus was concerned about the growing population of Europe outstripping the food supply. His pessimism led him to believe that its destiny was war and famine, as people struggled for relatively scarce food. If that sounds like an animalistic existence, it certainly did to Darwin, and it provided a perfect account of what the animals do to perpetuate their kind. Voila, natural selection. In the wake of the 20th century revolution in how physicists thought of the universe's workings, physicist George Gamow published stories of a Mr. Tompkins to illustrate relativity and quantum mechanics. This explanation of relativity begins with Mr. Tompkins seeing a single cyclist coming slowly down the street, and as he approached it, Mr. Tompkins' eyes opened wide with astonishment. For the bicycle and the young man on it were unbelievably shortened in the direction of the motion, as if seen through a cylindrical lens. The clock on the tower struck 5, and the cyclist, evidently in a hurry, stepped harder on the pedals. Mr. Tompkins did not notice that he gained much in speed, but as the result of his effort, he shortened still more and went down the street looking exactly like a picture cut out of cardboard. Through the story, Gamow explains what happens when we travel at the speed of light. Our dimensions shrink, at least from the perspective of Earth, because we are going so fast. Since it is difficult to imagine anything but light traveling at the speed of light, Gamow imagines a fantastic scenario to give us a sense of what is happening to light as it travels through the universe. He is describing the effects of light speed as though it were a man on a bicycle. This ability to treat one thing as though it were something else, gravity as though it were sunlight, animals competing for food as though they were humans struggling for sustenance, a bicyclist as though he were a beam of light, is a powerful tool for explaining complexities to those whom we do not expect to understand otherwise. An analogy, though, is not just a comparison. It is the treating of one thing as though it were something else. That something else, the analogy, illustrates important properties of the subject. Notice how the jazz pianist Johnny King describes jazz by talking about it as though it were conversation. And the way a typical jazz performance unfolds is a lot like the way a conversation progresses. Someone chooses a subject to discuss and takes the lead in expressing ideas and thoughts about that subject. She is soloing, blowing over the contours of that subject. Her fellow conversationalists enter intermittently with ideas and thoughts that the speaker has inspired and that will in turn inspire her. They are accompanying her, comping in the parlance of jazz, and making the conversation an interaction rather than a soliloquy. They'll soon get their turn to take the lead in conversation through their own solos. Note the times King talks about jazz as though it were conversation. Someone chooses a subject to discuss, takes the lead in expressing ideas. Note also the connection King makes to assure you that he is developing an analogy. She is soloing, blowing. On the one hand, he uses conversation words. Then he throws in some jazz words that make contact between the two domains of jazz and conversation. Distinguish King's analogy from another paragraph in which he simply compares. Let us take the language metaphor one step further. Once you have the ability to speak and to express your ideas, you don't simply ramble on in disconnected thought, at least not most of the time. Rather, you bring your expressive skills to bear on a topic of conversation or an anecdote or an idea you have. That topic is very much like the song you choose to improvise over. When Mr. X and company selected The Way You Look Tonight, they chose a topic of musical conversation. The notes and rhythms they played to each other and to the audience all spring from and have reference to the subject of the underlying song. King describes talking, expressing your ideas without rambling. Then he compares that to jazz, in which the musicians improvise over the basic topic, normally a melody to some song. There is no crossover language of analogy here, no connection between the two domains except through comparison language. That topic is very much like. The strength of the analogy depends on the number of correspondences between the subject and its analogy. The more relevant correspondences, the stronger the analogy. I use X and Y to illustrate this. X is the subject we want to explain. Y is the explanatory analogy. The correspondences take on superscripts. X, that is jazz, equals Y, that is language. X superscript 1 is song. Y superscript 1 is the topic of conversation. X super 2 is soloing. y super 2 is offering a thought. X super 3 is comping. Y super 3 is others offering opinions. That is the structure of an analogy. It helps us explain what otherwise might be unexplainable by treating a complex subject as though it were something more simple. We lose information, certainly, but nevertheless are able to communicate the concept behind the details. That's it for this edition. If you found this video informative, please like it and subscribe to my YouTube channel below. You can find workbooks to practice your writing skills at Amazon and my blog through the links that follow. Thanks for listening.